So welcome everybody back to Forward CloudSec in our next session, which is a tachygraph and listless defenders, looking beneath the attack surface with Jasmine Henry. So before she starts, I'd like to thank our sponsors, especially Uptycs, our silver sponsor. Uptycs provides the first unified cloud-native security analytics platform that enables both endpoint and cloud security from a common solution. With Uptycs, organizations can quickly prioritize, investigate, and respond to potential threats across their entire attack surface. Jasmine.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for being here. I am Jasmine Henry. I'm a security director at JupiterOne. I work in a role that blends security research and security practice. JupiterOne is a cloud-based attack surface and asset management company. I have a background in analytics, and I've spent a lot of my career doing security at cloud-native startups, particularly using security graphs. I've had the same hair color since 2014, which makes me very easy to recognize at conferences. Please say hello. And my favorite sport is WNBA. I've started bringing that up during public speaking because nobody ever comes and talks to me about it afterwards. I wish they would, but a lot of times people laugh, so it works. The kind of basis of today's talk is a very important quote by John Lambert, who is a distinguished engineer and VP of security at Microsoft. Defenders think in lists, attackers think in graphs. As long as this is true, attackers win. I think that this quote is incredibly important, and it plays a very critical role because it is often kind of a light bulb moment for people. It's when they realize sort of the advantage that comes with graphs for attackers. What this quote does not communicate, however, is the fact that it is really hard for defenders to think in graphs. This example is actually from John Lambert's website, and it's kind of an on-prem example, so I'll start here. And I think when analyzed, it can really show just why defender graphs can be incredibly difficult. John Lambert's example involves a terminal server and eventually access to a high-value asset. And as a defender looking at the top graph, it's really hard to see that high-value asset. I don't know how many high-value assets are surrounding it, but it really kind of looks like a mess. So in this example, the defenders have to prevent data exfiltration on commodity hardware, which terminal servers typically lacked user authentication and encryption. They need to monitor for indicators of credential theft, and they need to prevent attackers from using a trusted account to access an entitlement. The attacker's role in all of this is significantly easier. They can steal credentials, and let's say the first path they follow is illustrated in red. Maybe it doesn't work, but they just keep trying until something sticks to the wall. A more relevant example of an attacker using a graph is perhaps they see a Kubernetes cluster within a target environment. They can reasonably assume that there is pods, containers, image layers, and a layer SBOM surrounding based on outside information. From there, they're able to orient. They can find a layer SBOM and discover a vulnerable version of Log4j. They're able to decide what to do next, which maybe in this example, they consider lateral movement to a privileged pod and decide against it. And they determine they're going to attempt reading a mounted secret. And let's say they succeed and they get to a database with customer data. However, if they fail, they can now kind of go through this loop again with additional information. This is actually John Boyd's OODA loop, which is a military strategy model. So the research that I'm going to be sharing today involves data from 2,285 organizations. My data set was 272 million nodes and 880 million triplets, which I want to distinguish the difference between a triplet and an edge or a relationship. A triplet is a unique combination of two nodes and one edge. So a user who can access an application would be an example of a triplet. A firewall that is connected to the internet would be another example of a triplet. I also want to note that the organizations in this data set skew cloud native. So later in the presentation, when really horrible looking stuff comes up on the screen, and you are sitting there thinking to yourself, I'm above average, you're probably not. There was kind of a few guiding research questions that shaped this analysis. I think the primary one was to know where defenders need graph-based security techniques the most. Where are you going to lose the most advantage if you're relying on lists? Where are we failing in a way that we really need to rely on graphs? Looking at 880 million triplets was an attempt to understand the topology of attack surfaces and paths at organizations. And I wanted to understand as well how quickly things are being deleted. The 329 million deleted triplets is about 30 days worth of deleted data. That's what's retained within the data model. And then the final question was to use some kind of different measures of anomaly and risk measures, risk along attack paths, to see what we could determine about control coverage. The first calculation we did was actually a total bear. We calculated the relative frequency of path lengths from the internet node. So an asset that is directly connected to the internet is going to be n equals 1. An asset that is connected to an asset that is connected to the internet node is n equals 2, and so forth. What we discovered actually really kind of surprised me. It is really a tiny percentage of the asset inventory that is directly connected to the internet that has that first degree relationship. And there's also another slide that I don't have up today where I attempted to explain the topology of the attack surface and realized that I needed to revise my logic, because users are typically 3 to 4 degrees from the internet node, but they can access the internet and they can really do some damage. What is really interesting is that the majority of assets are between 2 and 7 degrees from the internet, with around 93% between 3 and 6 degrees. I really hypothesized that younger, more cloud-native organizations would typically have longer path lengths, and older organizations that had maybe kind of migrated to the cloud, been later to cloud adoption, would have shorter path lengths on average. I hypothesized that longer path lengths were a kind of a hallmark of sophistication in how organizations were approaching engineering. And within the organizations that we studied, we've got firmographics for about 10% of them. So there is the ability to kind of go in and check biases and hypotheses against organizations. The opposite was true. Older organizations who are not necessarily cloud native, that are kind of cloud adopters, actually had longer path lengths. And that was the first of many things I discovered in this research that really surprised me and was slightly hard to explain. Next, we did an analysis of critical asset path lengths, which critical, for the sake of this logic, is defined as a defender would define it: hosts, data stores, functions, logs, and code repos. Typically, an attacker is not going to be that interested in logs. They will probably be pretty interested in the rest. What I found here, again, kind of surprised and confused me. Critical asset attack paths are less varied than their non-critical counterparts. The majority of them occur at a distance of 4 or 5 relationships away from the internet node. They are 8% shorter on average, and they are just enormously more predictable. Analysis of the kind of asset types within those categories revealed that certain categories are extremely clustered within distances. I hypothesize that security teams tend to be more consistent in lifestyle practices around critical assets, and that this consistency breeds what can appear to an attacker to be predictability. And I don't think that we need to start being less consistent in how we treat our critical assets, but I think that we need to be aware of these patterns and how they can appear to attackers as predictability. I'm going to introduce an idea really quick. which is the DIE triad. It's an idea originated by my boss, Sunil Yu, who's not in the room right now, I don't think, which is that distributed architecture models can kind of defend against ransomware attacks, essentially. Immutable, the ability to detect and reverse change, can prevent unauthorized changes. And ephemeral, which is the area I really want to emphasize, is the idea of reducing asset value by shortening and defining the asset lifespan. If your hosts all die after 24 hours, you have fewer persistent attack paths, and it is much more difficult for attackers to achieve persistency. These assets are also less likely to accrue findings that are never resolved. Research on kind of beating OODA loops within warfare scenarios indicates that tempo, increasing the tempo of change, is one of the best techniques to win. The next analysis we did had to do with the lifespan of common triplets. You will notice that there's two data categories on the screen, one for living triplets, which is, triplets that have not been deleted, and one for dead triplets. We discovered the average finding that is living has a lifespan of 383 days, which is approximately twice the average US employee job tenure of 7 months. Something else that we noticed, and this was, far beyond just the kind of most frequent categories on the screen, is that triplets that are not deleted quickly tend to live for a very long time. I did not discover any patterns of that happening more at certain organizations than others. I think that some organizations are much better at kind of ephemeral architecture techniques than others. However, I think those same organizations have a lot of living blind spots. What is encouraging and positive is the fact that 67% of attack paths are churning each month. That is fantastic. However, there is really kind of a troubling disparity between the lifespans of living and dead triplets. Also, it's really kind of taking us a while on average to resolve image findings. Final idea I want to introduce today is around anomalies, and the categories of anomalies that we can see in today's cloud environments. White crow anomalies are easily identified with a single data point with static characteristics on an asset. In the data I was working with, the average lifespan of a living crypto key to a critical asset is 221 days old. You can look at that and pretty much tell that that should be much shorter. Another thing I saw was that admin access, the average age of that was 629 days old, which is not positive, especially if you're trying to do just-in-time access. A third example that was not within my data would be an employee whose age was over 300 years old. You can pretty much tell there's something wrong there. White crow anomalies can typically be identified as a static data point unless dynamic conditions are possible, dependencies are possible, or you're dealing with an attacker who's very skilled at deception. If any of those could be true, it is typically best to use graph-based techniques to identify anomalies. Three categories of graph-based anomaly detection include local risk, which is direct relationships. How many findings are attached to a single host? Global risk is indirect relationships. How many findings are attached to the relationships of a host, or which developers are creating the most findings? Third area that we didn't get into because it's very complex is community risk, which is an algorithmic anomaly detection method when you're trying to deal with scenarios that cannot be replicated. It was used to understand the Enron emails, which is a huge data set where there was a lot of kind of deception and very minimal communication. The first measure we looked at within anomalies was which attack surface classes are the most highly connected. Services, users, access policies, and host agents came out on top. Several of those categories there are critical. And what I really concluded from this is that connectedness is not inherently positive or negative. I think there's a lot of kind of intro to graph blogs that will tell you start by understanding which of your nodes are the most connected and start pruning those if you don't need them, which I agree with about half of that. If you have some nodes that you don't need, absolutely prune them. However, connectedness can also be a positive thing depending on the quality of relationships and depending on the node. If you have a policy that is extremely connected, I would view that as a positive because it may mean that you have really effective control coverage, or if you've lightened your policy administration load. The final kind of measure we looked at within anomalies was local and global risk exposure, which again, local risk exposure is direct risk relationships. Global risk exposure is risk along an attack path. There is no correlation between local risk exposure and global risk exposure. If an asset has higher local risk exposure and lower global risk exposure, that's actually a positive. It can signal effective control coverage or that your security program is managing blast radius. Several of the critical assets that are shown here, the hosts, images, data stores, and records all have lower global risk exposure than local risk exposure, which indicates that security teams are doing a pretty good job of kind of mitigating blast radius, even if they can't get to resolving those first-degree findings immediately. At a high level, if you're looking at your graph and you are seeing trends of low local risk exposure and high global risk exposure, that can be a reason to kind of double-click, zoom in, and investigate. See if you can add some controls. And finally, I will note that high global risk exposure and local risk exposure are an attacker's favorite conditions because they're likely to find multiple options every step of the way. Users are also an area of extreme risk, but I think that probably surprises nobody in this room. So in conclusion, I think that there were some things in this research that really kind of encouraged me. One of which was that attack paths are really churning over at a pretty decent rate each month. I think as security practitioners, we should recognize when our own behavior can create predictability for attackers. Increasing the tempo at which assets die or turned over, attack paths turn over, is one of the best mechanisms we have to foil opponents. Lists are not apparently worthless. Lists are really useful, and our brains are built to think of lists as easy and useful. However, I think that we need to be kind of ranking our to-do lists using more complicated graph-based metrics such as local and global risk exposure. And finally, I would say absolutely prune your graphs, but don't rely on connectivity as inherently a good or bad thing. Really consider attack path exposure to risks. I would like to acknowledge the rest of the JupiterOne research team. Greg Hamill worked with me on a lot of the triplet and path research. Phil Parker did a lot of local and global risk research. Sunil, my boss, is really great at telling me when something is not working, which I greatly appreciate. Any questions?
So Jasmine, we do have one question in Slack. So how do you think about incorporating humans, internal users, for example, in the graph?
So users are actually a class within the data model. And I think that one thing to think about is that a user may be several nodes in the graph because every user identity is typically a node. User groups that they belong to are also nodes. So I think that humans definitely are an asset within the graph, and they're certainly an asset that you need to manage the life cycle of. But a human does not equal a user identity. Awesome question.
Other questions in the room? So I do have a question. Have you thought about overlaying TTPs with those graphs, with those paths?
Yes. I think the best way to do that is there's been some effort to combine MITRE's attack graphs with Verizon's DBIR data set. That's something that happened in about the last 6 months. So it's something I would very much like to do as soon as possible, and as well as explore data sharing with MITRE.
I'm just curious how you collected all the data for building your graphs.
Yep. So my organization is a cyber asset and attack surface management company. This is graphs from companies that use our products. Both free and paid users is within the terms of service. Some companies do opt out. And what gets to me is very, very filtered for privacy. The data science role is not seeing any critical data. We have an open source version as well, which is available on GitHub if you want to go and inspect the data model.
Yeah. Oh, what's that called? The tool you mentioned?
I'm sorry?
Oh, what's the what you mentioned on GitHub?
Oh, there's actually a link on the next slide. Our data model is available on GitHub, and then we also have something called Starbase, which is a kind of layer over Neo4j if you want to kind of do an open source DIY security graph within your organization that way as well.
Is there any lessons learned? Just because I'm interested in like graphs in general recently, like especially around infrastructure and stuff. Do you have any lessons learned about kind of building that out?
Awesome. Awesome. Well, I would love to, connect afterwards. Thank you. Awesome. Well, I really appreciate everybody attending. Thank you.
Thanks, Jasmine.